I'm Bella Smith, and I was raised in an environment rich with the sounds of woodworking and the scent of fresh lumber. My father, Henry Smith, owned a family-run business that specialized in crafting handmade furniture, and my mother, Angela, complemented his artistic endeavors by managing the business aspects. She was often found in her home office, meticulously handling the finances and client communications, emphasizing to our clients that quality craftsmanship requires time. Growing up under the watchful eye of my grandfather's portrait, I was constantly reminded of our family's legacy. My father often spoke of how his father, and his father before him, had built the business from the ground up, instilling in me the importance of preserving this heritage. Although as a child I was more preoccupied with school and friends, this sense of responsibility began to resonate with me more deeply as I grew older. By the time I reached my 20s, I had started to engage more with the family business, spending summers learning the ropes in the workshop. Despite harboring personal ambitions of perhaps pursuing a career in law or medicine, I felt a growing connection to my family's craft. However, around the time I graduated from college at 24, I sensed a shift at home. My father seemed unusually preoccupied, spending more time in his office, and my mother's demeanor had shifted from her usual upbeat self to one of concern. One evening, unable to ignore the tense atmosphere any longer, I confronted my mother while we were preparing dinner. She reluctantly disclosed that our business was facing significant challenges due to the emergence of a new, cheaper furniture factory in our area. This revelation was unsettling, as it threatened the legacy that generations of Smiths had worked so hard to build. Just days later, while I was relaxing in the living room, my father urgently called me to his study. Inside, I met Mr. Lincoln Lopez, a stern man who seemed to scrutinize me thoroughly before nodding briefly. The atmosphere was tense, and although I was dismissed before I could understand the full context, it was clear that significant decisions were being made. In the days that followed, the air at home was filled with whispered worries and abrupt silences, making it evident that our family was on the brink of major changes. I couldn't shake the feeling that our legacy and way of life were about to be profoundly challenged. When I walked into the room that evening, the tension was almost tangible. It was a rainy Tuesday when my parents decided it was time to have a serious conversation. We gathered in the living room, where my father's expression was solemn and my mother fidgeted anxiously. "Bella," my dad started, his voice unusually shaky. "We need to discuss something important." I tensed, imagining all sorts of dire scenarios. He took a deep breath. "You remember Mr. Lopez from the other day? He owns the large furniture factory I mentioned before." My stomach sank as I recalled the factory that was threatening our family business. My mom's eyes were filled with sadness as she nodded in agreement. "Yes, honey, he's been quite aggressive in the market, trying to edge us out. But there's more," Dad added, prompting me to lean in, my heart racing with apprehension. After a heavy silence, he continued, "He has made an unusual offer." I braced myself for what was coming next. "He wants to arrange a marriage between you and his son." I was so shocked that I nearly laughed, thinking I had misunderstood. "I'm sorry, what?" The words struck me with disbelief. My mom quickly intervened. "It sounds extreme, I know. We're not pressuring you, sweetie. We just thought you should know." I stood up abruptly, my head spinning. "This is insane. We're in the 21st century. People don't arrange marriages anymore." My father's face was filled with guilt and concern. "I know, Bella, but the future of our company, your grandfather's legacy, it's all at risk." I paced back and forth, trying to digest this shocking news. "So, I'm supposed to marry some guy just to save our family business? This is medieval." I stopped and faced them. My parents, always supportive of my dreams and independence, now looked utterly defeated and desperate. "I need some time," I said at last, the room heavy with my declaration. "This is a lot to take in." Over the following week, I wrestled with the proposal. Part of me was outraged at the mere suggestion, yet another part, deeply connected to our family's legacy, considered it. After much internal debate, I decided to meet this man, Mr. Lopez's son. Just meet him, I told myself, no commitments, no promises. We arranged to meet at an upscale cafe. As I entered, My heart pounded. I looked around, trying to spot someone who might be him. Bella, a voice called out. I turned to see a guy about my age, with tousle brown hair and a friendly smile. I'm David Lopez. He introduced himself, not at all like the stiff, formal figure I had imagined. He pulled out my chair with a flourish and a wink. This is pretty weird, huh? He remarked casually. I laughed, a genuine sound of amusement breaking the tension. You could say that again. As we talked over coffee, I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation. David was funny, charming, and surprisingly down-to-earth. He even expressed his reservations about his father's old-school ways. Our casual meeting turned into hours of easy conversation, and I was surprised to find myself not wanting it to end. Over the next few weeks, David and I began to see each other more regularly. We went to movies, tried new restaurants, and spent lazy afternoons in the park. It was unexpectedly nice. One evening, as we walked along the river, David said thoughtfully, I think our parents might have been onto something after all. He paused, then added softly, I think I might be falling in love with you. My heart fluttered, a mix of surprise and joy washing over me as I realized I felt the same. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected arrangement could turn into something genuinely wonderful. As David confessed his growing feelings for me, I realized I was falling for him too. Our parents, particularly thrilled by this turn of events, saw it as a solution to the business pressures both families faced. A few months later, as we announced our engagement, I could see the sheer relief on my father's face, while Mr. Lopez, David's father, appeared almost triumphantly satisfied. At our wedding reception, Mr. Lopez pulled me aside. His demeanor was grave as he spoke in a low, earnest tone. Bella, David is a good person, but he needs direction. He needs to mature into a responsible man. I'm counting on you to help guide him. Can you do that? Taken aback by his direct request, I nevertheless promised to do my best. The initial years of our marriage were indeed a whirlwind. Keeping my promise to Mr. Lopez, I encouraged David to immerse himself more in the business world. Gradually, he began to distance himself from his carefree college days and took on more responsibilities at the office. You're a miracle worker, Mr. Lopez once remarked, clearly pleased with David's transformation. However, not everyone viewed these changes positively. David's mother, Sienna, always seemed to look at me with a mix of suspicion and disapproval, her tight-lipped smiles and curt nods barely masking her feelings. Meanwhile, our family business was flourishing. My father's company stabilized and even doubled its turnover within a year, bringing him immense pride and relief. However, I found myself restless. One evening, I mentioned to David that I was considering getting a job. The sound of his fork hitting the plate marked his surprise.
A job? Why?
Isn't our situation enough? He asked, incredulously. I explained that I wanted to contribute and use my education, but he dismissed the idea, suggesting instead that I engage in charity work, as was customary for women in our social circle. Despite my frustrations, I channeled my energy into founding the Smith-Lopez Foundation for Children with Developmental Challenges. It wasn't the career path I had envisioned for myself, but it provided me with a sense of purpose. Over the next decade, my life blurred into a sequence of charity galas and social commitments. Then, suddenly, David's father passed away, leaving David to inherit the company and assume the role of CEO overnight. 3 years later, another shock came. Sienna was diagnosed with advanced cancer. She revealed her condition over a Sunday dinner, her voice steady though her hands trembled. David immediately suggested placing her in a specialized care facility, but she adamantly refused, insisting on staying in her home. Stepping in, I offered a compromise. We'll arrange the best home care for you, Sienna. The top oncologists and nurses, whatever you need. To my surprise, Sienna showed me a rare sign of warmth, patting my hand in appreciation. As I devoted myself to Sienna's care over the following years, her icy demeanor toward me thawed. One day, as I adjusted her pillows, she looked at me sincerely and said, "You're a good woman, Bella. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Our relationship grew closer, but as it did, David became more distant. Free from his father's stringent oversight, He started reverting to old habits. His late nights at the office turned into nights spent at bars, and important meetings were missed. One night, he came home reeking of whiskey, a look of defeat in his eyes. "The company's gone bankrupt," he slurred. "It's all gone." I was completely taken aback by how quickly everything had deteriorated. "What are we going to do?" I asked David, feeling desperate. His response was sharp and filled with cynicism. "Hell if I know. I'm not suited for this business nonsense." In a bid to fix things, I put aside my ego and reached out to my father. "Dad, I need a favor," I started. Without any hesitation, Dad offered David a position as his assistant. David accepted it reluctantly, but I had a nagging suspicion that our problems were just beginning. The months that followed David's appointment were a disaster. I watched in despair as sales plummeted and my father's once thriving company started to decline. One evening, unable to watch passively any longer, I confronted David in our living room. "What's going on with you?" I demanded, frustrated. "This job was supposed to be your lifeline, yet you're treating it like it's a nuisance." David's laugh was bitter again. "A lifeline? Please, I'm just biding my time until I can get out of here." I was stunned by his coldness. "What do you mean?" His reply was chilling. "Once my mother passes away, I'll sell everything. Then I'm leaving." I felt a punch to my gut. "How can you be so cold? She's your mother." His disdain was palpable. "She's a burden," he retorted, "and this job is beneath me. I was a CEO, not some errand boy." My anger flared. "You ungrateful jerk. My father gave you a chance when you were at rock bottom, and this is how you repay his kindness. Meanwhile, I've been here, taking care of everything while you wallow in self-pity." I stormed out of the room, furious. In the hallway, I bumped into Sienna, whose expression showed she had heard everything. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and then she reached out and took my hand. Her touch was silent, but supportive. I squeezed her hand back, fighting back tears. Weeks went by with an uneasy tension until one gray Tuesday morning, my world collapsed. A police officer informed me that my parents had died in a car crash. I was numb, moving through the funeral preparations like a ghost, overwhelmed by loss. Throughout it all, David remained aloof, not once offering support. He didn't even attend the funeral. As I watched my parents' caskets being lowered, a mix of grief and anger surged within me. After leaving the cemetery, I called our company's secretary. "Is David at the office?" I asked. There was a pause. "Yes, he's in your father's office," she replied softly, her voice full of sorrow. Angered and still in my funeral attire, I drove straight to the company. Bursting into my father's office, I found David nonchalantly sitting in my father's chair, feet on the desk. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Get out of my father's chair now," I yelled. His response was dismissive, infuriating me further. "Your father's chair? I think you mean my chair," he retorted smugly. Attempting to reason with him, I pleaded, "David, please, this isn't right. My father just died." He banged his hand on the desk, silencing me. "Enough." I'd had enough of David's manipulations. "I'm finished with your moral lectures, Bella. Your constant nagging and improvements have made my life miserable," he declared with a sneer. I was shocked. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, but he just snarled back. "You heard me. You've been trying to change me since the day we married." "Well, surprise, I never loved you. I only married you because my father made me." His cruel words struck me deeply, and I staggered back, reeling from the impact. David's expression turned cunning. "Oh, and you might find this interesting. This company, valued at about $42 million, now belongs to me as the deputy director." I whispered in disbelief. "You can't do that." He smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Can't I? I control all the passwords and account access. I'm in charge now, Bella, and there's nothing you can do about it." To my horror, he turned to the computer and started transferring company funds to his account. "Stop it," I yelled, rushing to intervene, but he shoved me away. "If you don't like it, there's the door," He then flung a folder at me. It was a set of divorce papers. "Your choice," he said coldly. I caught the folder automatically, my mind spinning from the shock. But looking at David, this stranger who had replaced my husband, I knew I had to leave. Without a word, I left the office and drove directly to the office of Mr. Asher, my father's lawyer and close confidant. He greeted me with solemn eyes. "Your father anticipated something like this might happen," he said as he handed me an envelope. It contained my father's will and a letter. With trembling hands, I read it, tears streaming down my face. The business was mine, and David had been officially terminated 3 weeks before my father's death. The letter was heartbreaking. "My dearest Bella, if you are reading this, I am no longer here. I regret pushing you into this marriage and not seeing David for who he truly was. You deserve so much better. The company is yours now. Make it thrive again. Please divorce that worthless man. Live your life and be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. I love you always, Dad." Resolved and empowered, I looked up at Mr. Asher. "Please file these divorce papers immediately," I instructed. Heavy-hearted yet determined, I returned to the house that no longer felt like home. Inside, it seemed colder, emptier. I found Sienna, frail and wrapped in a blanket, in the living room. "Sienna," I began gently, "I need to tell you something. David and I are getting a divorce. I'm leaving." To my surprise, tears filled her eyes. "Take me with you, Bella, please," she pleaded. Stunned yet moved by her request, I was about to agree when the front door burst open. David stormed in, rage contorting his features. "You," he bellowed at me. "What did you do?" "The company accounts are blocked. I can't access anything." I stood firm, facing him with newfound strength. "The company isn't yours, David. My father left it to me, and I've signed the divorce papers. We're no longer married. You have no claim to anything here." David's face flushed a deep red, his eyes then shifting to Sienna, who was quietly preparing a small bag. "What are you doing, Mom?" he demanded. Sienna met his gaze with a calm steadiness. "I'm going with Bella," she declared. For a moment, David was too shocked to respond, the reality of his new situation slowly dawning on him. David erupted with fury, hurling insults at Sienna. "You ungrateful trash," he yelled. "After everything I've done for you." His words stung, but he was unrelenting. "Fine, get out. Both of you. I'm better off without either of you." And so, we left, moving into the house where I grew up. Taking over the company was a massive undertaking. Night after night, I sat up reviewing financial reports, determined to preserve my father's legacy. I brought Daisy, my father's trusted secretary, on board as my assistant. Her deep understanding of the company's operations was invaluable. Gradually, I regained control, and the company began to prosper again. We even expanded the charitable initiatives through our foundation. 3 years later, Sienna's health began to decline significantly. I reduced my work hours to care for her, ensuring her last days were as comfortable as possible. One quiet autumn morning, she passed away peacefully while I held her hand. I felt a profound gratitude for the time we had spent together. I arranged a beautiful funeral to honor her, sparing no expense. David, predictably, didn't appear. A few weeks after Sienna's funeral, I received a call from Mr. John, the Lopez family notary, asking me to attend the reading of Sienna's will. When I arrived at the notary's office, my heart skipped a beat. David was there, smug as ever, with a young woman on his arm. He sneered at me. "Well, if it isn't the grieving widow," he mocked. "Don't worry, this won't take long. I'll be taking my mother's money and treating my lovely Georgia here to a well-deserved vacation." I ignored his taunts and took a seat away from them. Mr. John began the reading, silencing the room. As the notary read through the will, David's smirk widened. But then, a sentence cut through the tension. "I, Sienna Lopez, being of sound mind, hereby bequeath all my assets, including my house and savings, to Bella Smith." The room fell silent. David's face dropped as Mr. John continued. It is my wish that Bella uses these assets to further support the charitable foundation for children with developmental problems, which she has passionately championed. Tears welled up in my eyes. Even in death, Sienna was showing her love and support. David erupted again. This is ridiculous. She must have manipulated my mother. Bella, you fraud. You've ruined my life, and now you're stealing my inheritance. His companion looked bewildered. Wait, you mean you don't have any monies? As she gathered her belongings, David's pleas fell on deaf ears. Georgia, baby, I can explain, but she was already leaving. David turned his anger back towards me. You'll pay for this, Bella. I'll contest the will. Mr. John interrupted calmly. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Lopez. Your mother's will is ironclad. She was of sound mind when she made these decisions, and I was witness to it. Defeated, David's resolve crumbled, and he left the office a broken man. As the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A sense of triumph washed over me, not because of the inheritance, but because justice had been served, affirming Sienna's faith in me and our shared values. Sienna's belief in me had stayed strong to the very end, a thought that filled my heart each time I reflected on it. Mr. John, I said, my voice heavy with emotion, I'd like to set up a trust for the foundation immediately. It's what Sienna would have wanted. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself wholeheartedly to the company and the foundation. Under my leadership, my father's business not only regained its past success, but soared beyond it, achieving new heights. Meanwhile, the charitable foundation expanded significantly, reaching more children and making a deeper impact than ever before. Each evening, as I sat in the office that had once been my father's and was now mine, I would pause and look at the photographs on my desk. There were pictures of my parents, their faces beaming with pride, and of Sienna, her eyes sparkling with playful mischief. Though they were no longer with me, their love and support continued to shape who I had become. Besides these photos, I kept a framed quote that had become my guiding principle. I picked it up and read the familiar words, which resonated more deeply each time. The most difficult roads often lead to the most beautiful destinations. This mantra reminded me of the journey I had traversed, filled with challenges and hardships, but leading to a place of profound fulfillment and purpose. Each word reaffirmed my commitment to continue their legacy, honoring their memory through every decision I made and every child we helped through the foundation.